It was a cloudy Friday morning when the Hartleys moved into the house on Windmere Lane. Elizabeth, a quiet 6-year-old with wide green eyes and a head full of curls, pressed her face to the rear passenger window as the moving truck pulled into the long gravel driveway. The house stood at the edge of a dense wood, its exterior painted a muted gray that seemed to absorb the already dim light. Ivy crawled along the walls, and the roof sagged just slightly on one side. "Looks old," Elizabeth whispered. "It's vintage," her mother, Caroline, corrected gently from the front seat, trying to mask her own unease. Her husband, Greg, said nothing as he parked, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. Inside, the house smelled of mothballs and something else, something faint, musty, earthy, like wet soil trapped in wood. The former owner had died the year before, an elderly woman named Mrs. Adeline Wren, who had no next of kin. The property had sat vacant for nearly 10 months before the Hartleys bought it at a fraction of the market price. They should have asked why. Elizabeth found the doll on the second day. She had been exploring the upstairs bedrooms while her parents unpacked. Most of the rooms were empty save for some old wallpaper curling at the corners and dust dancing in sunbeams. But one room, the one at the end of the hallway, was different. The door creaked when she pushed it open, revealing faded lilac wallpaper patterned with tiny birds, a chipped rocking chair in the corner, and a lone wooden toy chest under the window. Inside the chest, surrounded by yellowing newspaper clippings and brittle lace doilies, lay the doll. It was old-fashioned, with a porcelain face and glass eyes the color of rain. Her dress was tattered cream silk, and her feet were bare. What struck Elizabeth most was the doll's hair, long, dark, and tangled, almost like real human hair. A faded tag hung around its neck with delicate script that read, "For Elizabeth." The little girl's breath caught. She didn't tell her parents. The first night she slept with the doll beside her, she had strange dreams. She stood in the woods behind the house, barefoot, the air thick with fog. A little girl, about her age, stood a few feet away in a white nightgown, whispering something Elizabeth couldn't hear. Her face was blurry, smeared like wet paint, and she held something in her hands, a crumpled photograph and a bone. When Elizabeth tried to step forward, her feet sunk into the earth, as though the forest were trying to pull her under. She woke up screaming. Greg rushed in, bleary-eyed, and cradled her. Caroline came in moments later, pale and silent. "It was just a dream, honey." "Just a bad dream," Greg said. Elizabeth clung to the doll, whose porcelain face smiled quietly in the dark. By the end of the first week, things began to change. It started small. Whispering voices at night. The sound of footsteps in the attic. Doors that opened on their own, and once, a heavy picture frame crashing to the ground in the hallway without explanation. Greg tried to rationalize it. "The house is old. Drafts. Loose floorboards." But Caroline wasn't convinced. She'd found the hallway mirror smeared with something brown and sticky, like dried blood or rust. Elizabeth denied doing it. "I didn't," she insisted, "but Lizzie might have." Caroline frowned. "Who's Lizzie?" "The girl who gave me the doll. You said you found it in the chest." "I did. But it was hers first." That night, Caroline moved the doll into the hallway closet. She didn't tell Elizabeth. By morning, the doll was back on the bed, tucked under the covers beside her daughter. Caroline's breaking point came on the 11th day. She was cleaning the guest bathroom when she heard a soft humming, low, tuneless, coming from the end of the hall. The door to Elizabeth's room was ajar. She pushed it open slowly. Elizabeth sat in front of the mirror, hairbrush in hand, brushing the doll's hair. But it wasn't the act that unnerved Caroline, it was the fact that the doll's reflection didn't move. Elizabeth's own reflection mimicked her movements exactly. But the doll, visible in the room, sat eerily still in the mirror. Its rain-colored eyes stared straight at Caroline, unblinking. "Stop it," Caroline hissed, her voice trembling. Elizabeth looked up. She doesn't like being watched. That night, Caroline told Greg everything. About the dream. About the mirror. About how the doll kept returning no matter where she put it. Greg, ever the pragmatist, finally agreed to throw it out. They waited until Elizabeth was asleep. Greg took the doll, wrapped it in a garbage bag, and drove it 10 miles to a landfill. He didn't say a word on the way back, but something itched at the back of his mind, the way the doll felt heavier than it should have, like it was resisting. Elizabeth screamed the moment she woke up. "Where is she? Where is she?" Greg and Caroline tried to soothe her, to tell her it was gone. But Elizabeth began to wail, clawing at the walls until her nails broke, screaming the name Lizzie over and over again. Then, the doll was back. Sitting on the rocking chair in the lilac room. Wrapped in the same black bag. Unopened. Greg installed cameras the next day, one in Elizabeth's room, one in the hallway, and one facing the front door. He didn't tell Caroline at first, worried it would only heighten her paranoia. But he needed to see for himself. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. At 3:17 a.m., Elizabeth sat up in bed, eyes open. She climbed out from under the covers, picked up the doll, and walked to the middle of the room. Then she began to speak, not in her normal voice, but in a low, rasping whisper. "It hurts. It still hurts. The roots are still there." Greg leaned forward, breath caught. On the footage, the air behind Elizabeth shimmered slightly, like heat rising from asphalt. Then, just for a moment, a second child appeared, standing behind her. White dress. Blurred face. And a mouth that opened impossibly wide. Greg yanked the plug from the wall and destroyed the footage. But it was too late. Elizabeth changed after that. She didn't eat much. Her cheeks grew pale, and her eyes ringed with shadows. She stopped speaking altogether except to the doll. She would sit for hours, just staring at it, whispering, nodding, listening. At night, the Hartleys heard scratching in the walls, like fingernails, moving fast. One evening, Caroline found a phrase etched into the underside of Elizabeth's bed in jagged letters. "Dig under the tree." They thought she had done it herself until they saw the second line. "She's still there." Elizabeth couldn't have reached that spot. Greg dug under the tree the next day. A twisted oak stood at the far edge of the property, half its roots exposed like claws. He brought a shovel, half expecting to find an old animal skeleton. Instead, he unearthed a box. It was a wooden crate, old and weather-beaten, bound with rusted nails. Inside were the remains of a doll. No, not a doll. A child's dress, rotted and moth-eaten. Scraps of bone. A lock of hair, dark and brittle. And a photograph, 2 girls, arm in arm, one of them unmistakably identical to Elizabeth. But it wasn't possible. The photo was dated 1912. Written on the back were the words, "Elizabeth and Lizzie, summer before." Greg buried the box again and didn't tell Caroline. But that night, he dreamed of the woods. And a girl with a bone in her hands. The days after Greg dug up the box were worse than anything before. Elizabeth's behavior became more unsettling, more otherworldly. She stopped eating altogether and spent hours sitting cross-legged in front of the fireplace, holding the doll tight like it was her only lifeline. Caroline noticed the change immediately. Her little girl's bright green eyes dulled to a cloudy gray. At times, it looked like someone else was behind them, something ancient and hollow. One afternoon, Caroline found Elizabeth in the backyard, just beyond the oak tree. The girl was digging furiously in the dirt with her bare hands, whispering words Caroline couldn't make out. "Elizabeth, honey, come inside," Caroline urged gently. Elizabeth didn't answer. Her hands clawed deeper into the earth, revealing something small and dark. Caroline's heart dropped. She stepped closer and saw a second doll, smaller and more grotesque than the first. Its face was cracked and smeared with dirt, eyes missing. It wore a tiny white dress, shredded and stained. Suddenly, Elizabeth looked up. Her mouth twisted into a terrifying grin, one far too wide for a child her age. "Lizzie's doll," she said, voice not quite hers. "She wants it back." Caroline stumbled backward. That night, the house was alive with noise. Scratches in the walls. Soft, eerie humming from the attic. And, most disturbing of all, the sound of children laughing, but distorted, like it was underwater. Greg stayed up late, watching the security footage from the cameras he had reinstalled. At 2:13 a.m., the hallway camera captured Elizabeth standing perfectly still, her head slowly tilting back until her mouth opened in a silent scream. Then, the lights flickered, and the feed went to static. When the power returned, Elizabeth was gone. The search was frantic. Caroline and Greg called the police. Neighbors helped scouring the woods. But Elizabeth was nowhere to be found. Days later, a strange package arrived at the Hartleys' doorstep. No return address. Inside, wrapped in yellowing newspaper, was the second doll. Attached to its neck was a note, written in the same delicate script as the first. "She never left. She's always here, watching. Find us beneath the roots." Caroline's hands shook as she read. Greg's face was pale as paper. The two dolls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. That evening, Greg and Caroline decided to confront whatever haunted their home. Armed with flashlights, shovels, and nerves fraying to breaking point, they returned to the oak tree. The ground beneath was soft and dark, as if freshly disturbed. They began to dig. At first, it was just dirt and roots. Then, the soil gave way to something hard, a small wooden box, sealed with rusted iron clasps. Greg pried it open. Inside lay a handful of old letters, brittle photographs, and a small diary, bound in cracked leather. Caroline picked up the diary, flipping to the first page. The handwriting was shaky, aged, but legible. It read, "My name is Elizabeth Wren. I have a sister named Lizzie. We lived here, long ago. The woods are not kind to children like us. There are things in the roots that should never be disturbed. We tried to keep the darkness away, but it's coming back. If you find this, don't trust the doll. It is a vessel for what lies beneath." As Caroline read aloud, a cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing their flashlights. In the sudden darkness, something moved in the shadows, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo from the roots themselves. "Come to us." A hand, pale and twisted, emerged from the earth. The hand that emerged from the earth was no ordinary hand. Its skin was mottled and cracked, almost like old parchment, but beneath the decay, a faint pulse of life still throbbed. Greg grabbed Caroline's arm, pulling her backward, but the roots beneath their feet began to writhe as if alive, snaking around their ankles, pulling. "Run!" Greg shouted. But Elizabeth's voice rang out from the shadows, eerily calm and distorted. "You can't leave. Lizzie needs you." Caroline turned her flashlight toward the voice. There she was, or rather, what had become of her daughter. Elizabeth's eyes were black voids, and the doll clutched tightly in her hand seemed to glow with a sinister light, almost breathing in rhythm with her. Suddenly, Elizabeth's body twisted unnaturally, the doll's cracked face pressing against hers. A chilling screech echoed, piercing their ears and freezing their blood. Greg and Caroline fought the roots dragging them down, but the forest seemed endless, oppressive. "Join us," whispered the wind. Then, the ground beneath them collapsed. They fell into darkness. When they came to, Greg found himself alone in the dirt, his hands scraped and bloody. The doll lay beside him, its eyes gleaming. He scrambled up and looked around. The clearing was gone. Instead, twisted trees loomed, their branches like grasping fingers. Far away, faint giggles echoed, the laughter of children who had been lost here long ago. Greg's heart pounded as he realized the horrifying truth. Elizabeth was never gone. The doll had taken her. And now, it wanted more. Days later, the police found the house empty. No signs of a struggle. No trace of Elizabeth or her parents. Only the doll remained, perched on the fireplace mantel. Watching. Waiting. If you ever find a doll like Elizabeth's, don't touch it. Because sometimes, what seems like a toy is a doorway. A doorway to something ancient. Something hungry. Something that never forgets. The end.